just as glorious as the examples we just talked about, but much less glamorous, is the task of the individual who was commissioned by God to speak on his behalf to those who think they know him, but have been corrupted by outside or internal influence. In other words, we just got done talking about all of these people who had new revelation from God and got to carry that new revelation to people who didn't really know who God was. It's a much more difficult task to get a new revelation from God about who he is and take him to people who think they know who he is. To be a prophet amongst false prophets. And you have many books in the Old Testament where you see examples of this. Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, I just drew a complete blank. Elijah, Elisha, you've got all kinds of prophets that went before the nation of Israel, God's chosen people who had a revelation from God but had slid away from it, had been corrupted by outside influences, corrupted by their own internal influences, and God tries to go and show the people themselves and God and the difference between themselves and God and who God has revealed himself to be, and folks don't want to hear it. To be a prophet amongst false prophets, or to be a believer amongst skeptics, or live by principles in the company of people who are content simply to defend them, is another side of the work of illumination. Every generation, every age, whether it's our age, our parents' age, our grandparents' age, everybody says that the current age is darker than the one before. But in every age, God authorizes men to stand as beacons to point to the safety of his love. Consider the following passage. This is Matthew 5 and 12 through 14. Jesus speaking and teaching, he says, "Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. And ye are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is henceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out and trodden under the foot of men. Ye are the light of the world. A city set out on an hill, cannot be hid." Now, historically, the way I grew up and the way many of us have grown up is that we talk about the fact that salt has been used historically as a preservative. Salt's also used as a seasoning. If it loses its salty and it's meant to make people thirsty. And if salt loses its saltiness, if salt can't make people thirsty anymore, what's it good for? There's a slightly more culturally enlightened interpretation of what Christ was actually talking about. That's us trying to retroject our culture and our perspectives and our understandings onto the text. And that's not unreasonable, and it's not uncommon, but it misses the depth of what Christ is actually pointing to and talking about. In the cultural dictionary of the Bible, John Pillich provides insight into this metaphor that exceeds the grasp of modern cultural experience, based upon the study of culture and based upon a study of the culture and ancient Aramaic, which closely parallels modern-day Arabic. Pillich suggests that the phrase "salt of the earth" does not refer to the salt content of the ground or the saltiness of the salt, the salty flavor of the salt. In other words, Pillich takes a look at Arabic now, which is a very close relative of ancient Arabic. That's the language Jesus most likely spoke, because that was the common language of the region under their captivity at that time. And when it talks about salt of the earth, it's not referring to the salt that's in the earth. That's the way we've looked at it, is that you get the salt out of the earth, you put the salt on food, and if it's not making anybody thirsty, it's lost its flavor. That's not the cultural perspective of that phrase. Sometimes you have idioms that mean something that are a little bit different. Salt of the earth refers or deals with earthen furnaces or clay ovens that were common to the region of that day, which used salt as an integral part of making that furnace work. In other words, we know that within the region, within the Roman Empire, within the Middle East in general, they would make furnaces where they would dig down into the earth and make a big fire pit. Or they would use clay to have a raised structure that they would also use as an oven.